Hi, everyone.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Suki Steckel, and I'm with Intac, and I will be your moderator for this session. And I'm very pleased to welcome Skylar Blankenship, who is going to present to you Identity Affirmation and its impact, non-binary and transgender identities. Please help me in welcoming Skylar. And please do remember to put your questions about the content of their session in the Q&A bubbles on the vertical menu, and please join us in staying engaged via the chat. And I'll be here to support all of you along the way. Take it away, Skylar.
Hi. I'm Skylar. I'm going to have everybody go ahead and put it in the chat, the name that they want to use, their pronouns, and just because we're from everywhere, what state you're from. Awesome. And I'll keep talking as this goes, just so that we can be more familiar with each other. I feel like having at least a mutual respect of names and pronouns is really important. So obviously, as you can tell by the beginning of the slide, I'm here to present on identity affirmation and its impact on non-binary and transgender youth. So there's going to be a lot of content, and we got a little less time than we had anticipated, so I might be a little bit quicker to go through information, but I promise there is space for everybody to speak, and we will get there. Okay, there we go. So before we get started, a little bit about me is my educational background is that I received my bachelor's from Central Michigan University in psychology, child development, and communication disorders. And then I went on to get my master's degree in clinical mental health, both at Central Michigan University. Some experience that I have with this is that I started public speaking during my undergraduate degree just about 10 years ago, if that dates me at all. And I've covered topics including like sexual health, mental health, suicidality, transgender and non-binary identities, sexual assault and intimate partner, and domestic violence. And within those, many of those topics, I talked about specifically like LGBTQ populations and have more of a focus on trans populations. So just kind of kicking it off, again, my name is Skylar and my pronouns are they, them, and in ella in Spanish. I identify as non-binary transmasculine, and I have been working within the community for several years. Local to here in Grand Rapids, last year, I was part of the Trans Icons in the Making, which is a scholarship program for trans individuals to help like with higher education that are trying to work to better the community. So I was really lucky to receive that, and it's been a really great experience. So I really hold that special to me, and I continue to carry it into really charging my advocacy, not only as a person in the community, but also as a therapist. I work in a community-based agency where I'm an outpatient therapist for youth and families. So we'll start with some ground rules just because there is some discussion base in this. My first thing is always share the floor. We all have incredibly important things to say and bring things to the table and all kinds of perspectives. So being able to share the floor, like sharing the mic, we all have things to say. So making sure we're sharing that. And then take what you need and leave the rest here. So taking lessons, taking information with you, but also making sure to leave stories and personal information here in this room because we want to respect confidentiality, as well as speak for yourself. It's really easy to kind of take an overarch in our dialogue, but also making sure that we're speaking from our own experiences just because everybody's is different. And then lastly, please respect pronouns, names, and identity. We're not here to police. We're not here to use the wrong names or pronouns, and just making sure that we're really keeping a respectful space. And at any point, if I am talking too fast, please let me know. I am a fast talker. So if you're like, Skylar, I need you to slow down, please say so. Okay. So I believe you're able to turn your mics on. I have never used AirMeet before, so this is an adventure for all of us. I just kind of want to, before we dive into it, see what folks have experience with trans and non-binary youth. Do you work with them? Do you have family members or children? Do you work within the community? I think you can just turn on your mics. Or maybe not. Maybe I am incorrect. Okay, there we go. I can see it in the chat now. It took a second. Okay, great. And I just encourage those to keep coming in. It's really great to see different experiences from everybody and just really see how we interact in the community or the services we provide, or even just really the education that comes in. And then also just within that, also as we answer that question, what are some ways that you could positively impact this community in your life? I see a lot of folks who have children or like are foster parents, which is great. As well as lots of folks that work in the community, which is also great because I love seeing that everybody's coming to expand their knowledge or come into a space where they can have dialogue. Awesome. And then for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of skip forward, but please keep putting that in the chat. Okay. So I want to preface this by saying that while this isn't a complete list, it does give the understanding of the basic terms of identities within the population I'm going to talk about today. And so these are the identities under the umbrella, specifically just for the purpose of this presentation. So with a lot of the studies and research that I've had under the transgender umbrella, it was very like basic down to transgender man, transgender woman, and some non-binary folks also identify as transgender. Whereas a lot of the research indicating for non-binary identities was trans masculine folks, trans femme folks, and agender, bigender, neutrois, gender nonconforming, and a lot of other terms. So from some of the research, it kind of identified that trans masculine folks that are non-binary leaned towards more masculine traits or identity, whereas the opposite side, trans femme, went more towards that more feminine identity and identification. So we'll kind of go into the next part, which is some mental health diagnoses. And while this is not comprehensive in the least bit, and there is way more research left to be done, for the sake of the research that I'm using in this presentation, the three basics that were covered were depression, anxiety, and suicidality. So for the purpose of this presentation, depression is the chronic experience of hopelessness, sadness, and despair. So those tend to be the most clinical beginning, like symptoms of depression. So that was a lot of what was focused on in the research, as well as anxiety being episodic or chronic experiences of elevated fight or flight response, worrying thoughts, and uncontrollable panic. Again, these are our basic markers. And so that's really what the research that I had looked into has followed. As well as for the purpose of this presentation, suicidality was classified as thoughts, urges, or intent to end one's life. And this can include passive thoughts, thoughts of intent, plans, and action. So let's look at some statistics and really just see kind of how this impacts the community. So a research article by Ashley Austin in 2020 found that the internet is providing trans and gender diverse youth affirming spaces that, for the most part, don't exist in their online lives. And then within that, these experiences are fostering well-being, healing, and growth. And they found in through 5 processes. One was building an escape from stigma and violence, as well as experiencing belonging, building confidence, feeling hope, and giving back. these online experiences are giving them a space where they can go to seek out their own community, as well as exist in a space where they can come as they are. And while that's not 100% everywhere and all inclusive of the internet, it is something that has been found to be an experience. As well as being able to find these communities online, they have a sense of belonging, right? You are intentionally entering a space where you are accepted, you have common like interest, experience. And within that, being affirmed in those spaces is building that confidence, right? The longer we're affirmed in our identity, the more sure and the more strength we have in it. And then feeling hope, having those affirmations, building that confidence, and having a space that's safe and welcoming really gives hope that, well, life is worth living, it's worth existing in. And then giving back. The online community is a great way to give back to other trans and non-binary individuals, both as adolescents and adults. It's where we can give advice. It's where we can really share our knowledge, share our research, share other community events, even outside of the internet, that we can go and belong. For the most part, though, there are a lot of really great online support groups and really great communities that are fostered online. Due to COVID, a lot of our support groups moved to a more online format. While there's cost and benefits to that, there's a lot more access now to have that belonging, at least in a face-to-face format, where through most of it used to be chat logs. I see Discord. So Discord. Trans and gender diverse youth are experiencing some pervasive stigma, discrimination, and violence in homes, schools, and communities, right? We've heard stories of kids in rural towns experiencing such heavy stigma and unfortunately higher rates of death and suicidality. And that's not exclusive to rural communities. We see that in, well, metropolitan cities, suburbs. It really relates back to the place that you live, but then you add on also schools. Schools add another entire layer to this, because with adolescence, there's a power dynamic, right? We have teachers, principals, and other adults that already have a higher power dynamic because they're adults. So not only do we have peers of the same age enforcing this stigma, discrimination, and violence, we also have adults that not only are reinforcing that in their peers, but also sometimes also contributing to that, which not only is that just not okay because you're utilizing that power dynamic, but it's also reinforcing the idea that who this child is, who these youth are, is not valid, it's not okay, and it's not safe. So social supports a sense of belonging and the ability to live authentically, which is to live and be treated in a manner consistent with the gender identity rather than the gender assigned at birth, are key sources of that resilience among these individuals. Excuse me. So creating these systems are really important. And what we're seeing is that offline, these experiences aren't as common, especially in smaller areas or areas who have a higher rate of poverty and have a really lack of sense of education due to so many different socioeconomic barriers. And then another study that was done by Durwood found that self-worth is an important predictor of future mental health outcomes. I mean, I feel as if that could be self-explanatory, right? Even taking it out of trans and non-binary populations. Really, our sense of self-worth can be a really big predictor of our future success, our future resiliency, and really a lot of that ties into our mental health outcomes. By identifying these students as they are and affirming their identities, listening to these voices come to us and say, this is who I am, and this is what I need to continue to be who I am. By continuing to just honor that and affirm that and give them a voice, we're helping predict future mental health outcomes. The longer we see depression sit in youth, and a lot of times identity that is not affirmed takes away that sense of belonging, which feeds into that depression. And the long-term depression becomes worse depression and can lead to other mental health outcomes as well. And then the study found that youth that were able to socially transition had similar depression and anxiety rates as cisgender youth. Sorry about that. I think my slides just disappeared. There we go. Are my slides still up for everybody? Okay, perfect. They disappeared for me, so I wasn't sure if they disappeared for everybody else. Awesome. So the study found that youth that were able to socially transition had similar depression and anxiety rates as cisgender youth. So even just that ability to socially transition, which takes away physical transition, including hormones, surgery, any different types of identity affirmation like care in terms of medical. This is just socially. So that can include dressing in a way that affirms their identity. This can include utilizing their name in social situations and within groups. That is their name and utilizing their pronouns. They had similar depression and anxiety rates as cisgender youth. So we know the statistics are relatively high still for depression and anxiety in cisgender youth, and just really youth in general, due to like brain functionality, just existing factors. So seeing that is similar is a big deal. It's that social transition component, that simple identity affirmation is really raising or lowering that depression and anxiety rate in that community, as well as they had similar rates of self-worth as their cisgender student counterparts. So, though, like we said earlier, that rate of self-worth is what helps predict not only positive future mental health outcomes, but also increase that sense of belonging, which increases positive outcomes, and really just a great affirmation. Okay. And then some more research from Dr. Olson found that socially transitioned prepubescent transgender children showed typical rates of depression and only slightly elevated rates of anxiety symptoms compared to the population averages. So normally there is a big gap in the rates of depression and anxiety in transgender and gender nonconforming youth versus cisgender populations. So, and there's a little bit more statistics later in that. But to see that those rates are very similar is astounding, to say that that impact is so important, that socially transition was able to provide that identity for them, the affirmation to really be who they are, which increases their self-worth, because, well, getting to be who we are increases our self-worth, right? It shows that we're worthy of being in this life, in this community, in this world as who we are, not maybe necessarily who tells us who we are. And then they concluded in the study that the findings suggest that familial support in general, or specifically via the decision to allow children to socially transition, are associated with better mental health outcomes among this population. So familial support is a huge thing, right? Just in general, we think about the support we have from our parents, our siblings, and really our whole family in how we interact with the world. They're our first support system or lack of support system. So this is how we learn to interact in the world. This is how we learn what support is. And if we have that support not affirming who we are, not accepting that identity, well, that sense of belonging is diminished. And then going in to school where their identity may also be diminished, and really other places in the world, it's creating a gap in that support and that affirmation, and really leading to some of the negative core values that, like, who I am doesn't matter, or who I am is wrong. That really feeds into that depressive and sometimes anxiety behavior. And parents really being supportive of the decision for their children to socially transition gives them a sense of belonging, really support, being able to have more support in that area, right? Children don't always have the most power, adolescents either, because, well, they're young and it's adults' responsibility to kind of help manage that world, whether that's for better or for worse in some situations. So, really being able to have that power to explore that, be that, and really affirm that that is the life that they're going to live with powers that assist in the easier time is really important. And this also carries into hopefully having support systems to enable that identity in school, having parents going to the school and assuring that this name and this identity is being affirmed and they are being who they are at school. And it really ties back to that sense of belonging, that sense of self-worth, and it really just gives a positive mental health outcome. And so there's some more from Dr. Olson. The articles that Dr. Olson has put out have been really great. So I referenced it a lot in doing some more of my research alongside what I've experienced being in the community and working with trans youth as well. So the observational evidence has shown that once children have socially transitioned, the intense gender dysphoria often settles down and shows improvement in behavior and mood. And while that's also not an exact science, that social transition so early in life helps reduce some of that intense gender dysphoria because, well, they're being affirmed, they're being socially accepted in who they are. And it gives a really big validity. And so that dysphoria, as it settles down, having a better behavior and mood, it's reducing rates of depression because, again, it ties back to the self-worth and the self-affirmation as well. Because being affirmed from our supports around gives us the ability to also internally affirm ourselves. It gives us the strength to know that who I am is okay. My identity is okay. Like I belong as I am. And so this also starts to reduce the inter-peer interactions where there's bullying and really just not okay behavior, like higher like aggression, higher really like verbal aggression on top of physical aggression, and just like that sense of diminished peer belonging. So seeing behaviors and mood improve with that because they're not in a constant state of fight or flight, not knowing if they're safe at school or if they want to be there even because they're going to face so many like obstacles. And then professionals should have no concern over supporting the family or mental health team's decision and reassuring the parents that social transition should have little to no negative impact on their child's mental health. So a big thing that was going around a few years ago and is also unfortunately resurfacing again is that allowing children to transition, it creates a sense of misunderstanding, confusion, and negative mental health outcomes because you're allowing your child not to just be who they are. You're taking away that sense of you're letting them play, dress up, and all of the awful rhetoric that goes around with that. And so a lot of professionals have been back off about it because of a lot of, unfortunately, the media and what it says. And there shouldn't be a concern of that negative mental health impact because, well, a lot of the research shows that it's actually the opposite, that by allowing social transition, even in younger youth, actually increases positive mental health outcomes, especially in the future. And then just we've talked kind of about the basic rates of like depression and anxiety within this context, but what about suicide and suicidality? Well, in a study that was created by Durwood 2016, and obviously it has been updated significantly, and there is another research coming out too to have these rates measured, that some estimates have suggested that as many as 41% of transgender adults have attempted suicide in their lifetime. But what we remember is that trans adults come from trans children. And this study with adults was young adults. So we already know that at that age, like particularly 17 to 24, one of the second leading causes of death is suicide. And then by Austin in 2020 is that suicide risk is particularly high with the transgender and gender diverse populations. Data indicated that 82% of trans individuals have considered and contemplated suicide, and 40% have attempted suicide. That is an astounding number. Even just the attempt rate is incredibly high. That's almost half. And this is inclusive of both adults and youth. And that's a really heavy population. And then the United States Transgender Survey found that among respondents who attempted suicide, more than 1/3, so 34%, reported that their first attempt was at the age of 13 or younger. 13 or younger, that's middle school and younger. And unfortunately, the study didn't say the relative younger age, like if this goes to 7 years old, 5 years old. So to truly have the impact of that statement without even just that young specifier is so powerful. And another indicator of why social transition is so incredibly important during these formative years. And 39% of respondents reported that their first attempt at court occurred between 14 and 17, which the suicidality rate of that age is also heightened. But even more so, the impact, those percentages are high and they're not far off from each other. But to think that anywhere from 17 to younger, the rates of over a third of these children are thinking about attempting suicide because of rates linked to depression and anxiety and living in constant states of, most have reported, fear of not knowing even if they're safe. And so also being not affirmed, you're living in a space where you don't belong. It's a message constantly that who you are isn't who you are. You're wrong. It's wrong. Hearing that from everywhere and not having that affirmation, of course, that sense of belonging is diminished. And when we don't feel secure, our rates of depression heighten. And then as our depression continues to heighten, those thoughts, that prolonged sense of despair and unbelonging, really creates that helplessness, that hopelessness, and really just creates an environment where this is not feasible to live in a world where you can't be you. And then kind of what did all this mean? The statistics indicate that there's not enough affirmation happening outside of virtual settings. And this can further down the line present other risks. So really, we can't just live in an online world, right? COVID has made that a little more of a commonality and ability. But at the end of the day, especially as things begin to open up more during the pandemic, living in a completely virtual world just isn't feasible. And that leaving those virtual settings where they are being affirmed, where they are living in a space where they are okay to exist as who they are. They're hearing the messages that who they are belongs, who they are is real. And really having to step away from that and go out into another version of the world that is also applicable to their life. And hearing the messages that are almost contradictory to that, right? That being trans is wrong, being non-binary is wrong, being anything other than cisgender is wrong, and you're not those things, and so many other awful things. But not only does that parallel really stagger and astound somebody from hearing such strong messages on two different sides, we're also taking that one safe space to really bring it into a space that's not safe, and it presents other risks, right? We go back into a world with that lack of affirmation and that lack of rights, essentially. And you see other risks like verbal aggression, right? Being harassed, being yelled at, being preached at about how wrong you are and what you're doing is not right. You're also leaning into other risks like violence, right? We have not only violence in the classroom, like shoving, kicking, but we also see that there is significant deadly attacks. There's murder. There's such intense, like, assault that it does eventually lead to either death by injuries or just a really negative impact. And we see those repeated instances of trauma going into other risks too, as well, with like substance use to deal with trauma, to reduce that fight or flight, and to really find a way to cope, and also just substance use in general. Um, so there's a lot of risks that come from this, as well as, transgender, gender diverse, and NB populations have higher rates of suicidality because of this lack of affirmation in their daily life, in their connections and systems. They're not getting that affirmation in a lot of places, a majority of this community. While I won't say 100%, a majority of this community does face a lot of lack of affirmation, right? We see it really anywhere, the news, in schools, in agencies. So doctors, mental health practitioners, really anybody, specialists, they see, we're seeing that there's a lack of affirmation and not really being able to create a system where trans and gender diverse individuals and youth can be. They're not going into a space and hearing their names, hearing their pronouns, acknowledging that who they are. And it's really despairing. It's hard to live in a world where you don't belong because everybody else is saying you don't belong, right? And so that despair really creates this hopelessness. And that's why we see higher rates of suicidality. And then those that are affirmed have similar rates to cisgender teens. So we saw that when teens are identified or are affirmed in their identity, they are showing similar rates of mental health outcomes as cisgender teens. Whereas in society, a typicality is that cisgender teens are really truly validated in who they are because that's what society deems as the appropriate, right? So they're being affirmed in their name, their identity, and their given expression. And so when we have these socially transitioning youth that are also being affirmed in the same way, we're seeing similar rates to mental health outcomes. I see a question. Looks like Millie said, how can we encourage our young person to move from the safe virtual world they have found when nearly all communication with peers is virtual as well? That is a really great question. And I would hope to have a more comprehensive, like, all-knowing answer, but it's still something that we're all still trying to figure out because this is definitely the age of technology, right? Kids are glued to their phones, and a lot of this communication has become virtual. And that also is in part with COVID, but it's also in part with that's just the technology that's been changing in our communities. And I really think that we need to create more affirmative spaces. We need to create those safe spaces that exist outside of the virtual world, right? How can we expect these kids to move into these spaces outside of the virtual world when they have no other safe space? And typically the safe spaces that are virtual are creating those communication, like, lifelines, like you said, with like text, Snapchat, because that's what's, well, accessible, right? And no matter time or day or weekend or not, they're able to communicate with their peers. Whereas going to school, you know, they see them for a little bit of time, and that can be great or awful. So what we see is that that's a consistent communication method for them as well. So it's, how are we making systems in a place that's safe to communicate, but also accessible? Because so many things are limited to virtual for these youth because there aren't a lot of spaces to go. So a lot of like social like areas aren't always affirming, they're not always safe. So that limits their ability to go out and do things in the community that otherwise, like, their cisgender peers could. So it's really about changing that. And I really like that question a lot. And I wish I had more of a definitive answer. And that's something that I know a lot of research is going into and a lot of people are talking about. So I hope to continue to be part of that conversation, and I encourage others to as well. But yeah, that's essentially my take on it. But I would love to hear other people's takes too, because I think that we could all have a lot of input on that because we all have different experiences with these youth. And then affirmations, the affirmation of these identities are showing that rates of mental health and suicidality are lower when these affirmations occur. Right? Again, it goes into self-worth, self-belonging, acceptance, safety. So many versions of affirmation create that sense of belonging, that sense of self, and sense of worth, right? When we have people affirming us and really validating and seeing us as who we are, it gives us worth because we're part of the world. And what we see in youth is that when they are a part of the world and they're affirmed in who they are, their suicidality lowers because those negative impacts with like depression and anxiety of constant hypervigilance and all of that is lowering. So we're lowering the rates of suicidality. And by affirming them, we're reducing these negative mental health outcomes, which is in turn also reducing our suicidality rate. And this is definitely non-comprehensive, and it's still relatively basic, but some ways to validate identity is pronouns. One, ask them and honor them. I think it's important too to realize that sometimes part of the conversation is us as adults, right? We can honor pronouns, but do we ever ask, right? Do we ever? And obviously there's so many awkward ways and limited ways to ask, but sometimes even just asking or introducing ourselves with our own pronouns gives that safe space to not only present their pronouns, but also gives a way to always have it out there to be honored. And then normalize asking names. So even just within cisgender youth as well, not everybody goes by their given name, their first name even. I know children who go by their middle names or a nickname. So in general, this is a great thing to ask, but especially with transgender and gender diverse populations, because they may not otherwise have a space to introduce themselves with that name. And we don't want to unintentionally validate their experience by calling them a name that's not theirs. And then I see two questions. I promise I will get to them in just a second. And just normalize asking that, because as a default, it's a great way to just affirm anybody and really basic respect, right? I know that I wouldn't like to be called a name that's not mine. And somebody asking me really validates the fact that they really want to know who I am. They really want to know who I am, what I am, like in terms of like, what am I about? And so by giving my name and pronouns and being asked those things is a great way to share that in a safe way. And then holding space to be safe and explore. Identity and gender is an ever evolving process. There's no A to B with transition. Our identities, I believe that as we come out with new words and new ways to identify, we really resonate with those things. And we continue to find better ways to describe ourselves to really explain to others who we are. And part of that for youth is incredibly important because they're already just trying to figure out who they are as like a teenager, a youth, and navigating the world in that whole development. So then to add on the additional, like, trying to figure out who they are with their identity, with their like expression and every part of it of being transgender in this society is an added complication, an added journey, an added like stressor. So for us as adults to hold that space for them to not only be safe in who they are, but also be safe to explore it is incredibly important. It's a great way to validate identity because there may be times where that isn't a space that they have otherwise and they really don't get to know who they are. Okay. So it looks like Christy said, how can families and caregivers best support and learn alongside youth who are looking to begin hormone treatment as part of their transition journey? That's a really great question. So hormone treatment, it can get a little tricky with youth, mainly because there's a lot of system factors within that, right? Hormones, and more so than not, we're seeing youth that are using hormone blockers, right? They're blocking different hormones from coming through as they're reaching like prepubescent like hormone stages, right? We're trying to block those hormones to limit that transition of like actual pubescent. But it can get really tricky within that because you also have to think about finding a provider that is willing to do that, is willing to work and learn alongside you essentially on how to do that. And unfortunately, those providers are few and far between. The system has not set up to give that information to a lot of medical professionals as they're going through school. There's not a lot of education. And then you run into personal beliefs as well. And the liability. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of bills and laws being passed to do so many things to penalize providers from providing affirmative, like transitional care to youth, which really, really changes the aspect of the ability. So I think that that's really part of the journey, is really finding a way to have access to that care, in which unfortunately there isn't a lot. Some people also find issues with providers accepting insurance and having a lot of those also barriers. But a best way that a caregiver can like really learn alongside these youth, or well, to learn alongside these youth, right? Looking at research, looking at experiences. This youth is finding this information, and the internet is a great place to do that. So really taking the time to learn with them, looking for those resources, listening to the community, and really looking at what that transitional journey could look like based on like their age, their ability, their how they want to transition into who they are. So I guess my best advice is, well, what you already said, to learn alongside them. And then, like Michelle said, how would you respond to someone who says, I don't do pronouns? Well, and perfect fashion, I am snarky. I would be like, I don't do you not doing pronouns, because that's not acceptable to me. Obviously, a youth isn't going to do that because of power dynamics, and most people aren't as snarky as me. And I guess my best response too is why? Because really, I want to know why. Is it that we don't truly understand pronouns? Is it that we aren't educated on it? And is it just trying to be a butthead, or just really opposing a belief in a rooted belief that they have or that they've been taught? And I've had conversations like this with people, right? I've experienced many of people who say that I don't do pronouns. And a lot of it is, I want to know why. Because if I can have the why, there may be a conversation I can have to be like, okay, well, I can see where you're coming from in terms of I understand the thought process, but like, let's see how it looks on this process, right? Like, how are we going to have that talk? And then kind of added on to this too is that I've had extended family members say that in reference to my child. And honestly, I'm offended by it, as if it negated my child's experience in reality. Yes. At that, absolutely. Yeah. It's very unaffirmative, right? It's somebody telling somebody that their experiences in reality aren't valid. They're not real. That having a way to explore who you are isn't it. It's not it. And that can be really unaffirmative, and it's offensive, right? We shouldn't have the right to tell somebody how they choose to identify or how they choose to express themselves. And I really think asking for that elaboration is really great because, like you said, kind of that they may not understand what pronouns are. And that's really great because sometimes we have to meet people where we're at and where they're at, and we have to come together and find something. And sometimes it's just not going to happen, unfortunately, that we're not going to be able to meet a middle ground and work from there. Some people just don't get it or don't want to get it. And that's just kind of where that is. And it's really just comes down to why don't you do pronouns? And that's, yeah. And it looks like we've got about 15 minutes. So I promise there's some discussion components of it. Ideally, the discussion components would go with mics, but I don't know if that's a thing that can happen. I am not tech savvy in the least bit. Okay, perfect. We do have a way. Thank you so much for technical people because I am not. Again, kind of like, what does this all mean? Let's talk about what these numbers mean and how they impact our everyday lives, right? So let's actually have a discussion about this. Like, sorry, that was like the title, like, I'm going to throw more information at you. Nope, this is, we're actually going to talk. So anybody can jump in. You can either type in the chat or unmute your mics. I can't see a lot of the chat, so excuse me if I don't see it, so I'm sorry. So the first question is, after hearing this information that you did today with me, what was your first thought after hearing that?
Just a quick note to everybody to join the discussion. You can't actually unmute, but what you can do is just post in the chat that you have a comment, and I will add you onto the stage really quickly, and then you'll be able to unmute that way. So just post in the chat if you'd like to speak. Thank you.
Okay. Looks like Emily would like to speak.
Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. What I took from this presentation was we need to be advocating in more creative ways, especially when we're thinking about mental health and working in these systems. I know there was a lot of data that was presented and a lot of unfortunate statistics. So, we're having these conversations, but how do we move forward? How do we advocate fully for these youth who are, these might be their darkest days that they're living through, and how do we get them to adulthood to be successful? This isn't my first conversation or webinar where I've talked about non-binary and trans folks, and so it's just continuing. I'm so glad so many people are here, but just how do we go forward? How can we each do our part to make sure that these kids grow up to be adults, and are having the services they need. Thank you so much, Skylar.
Yeah. And I 100% agree that this is definitely a continuing conversation and we need more creative ways to do that. And I do actually talk about that, not today in this presentation, but that is a thing that I have presented to on is how do we keep the conversation going? How do we get creative to continue to evolve with society, really? Like said earlier, the age of technology has changed a lot of things for our youth. And how are we as professionals outside of that helping them to, as you said, become adults and be more well-adjusted and less negative mental health outcomes?
I have a question / comment, Skylar. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was wondering, and this came up in the chat a little bit. I was wondering about your thoughts on some of those ways to be a better advocate that Emily talked about. And there's the backlash that I've seen around this is, people use rhetoric like, being transgender is like a trend or fashionable, or I mean, just and on and on and on. I mean, there's a lot. I don't want to repeat any of it. But I'm just, in my experience and my knowledge and my learning around this, like there's so much information just about basic science and human development that people just don't know. There's a reason that people think there's only two biological sexes, and that because that's all that people were ever taught, just en masse. And that's my take on it. And so I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the value to try to expand people's understanding of just the basics, like the kind of like gender identity 101. Like we're talking about kind of much more intensive, in-depth, like statistics and things, but like how does a parent who's never heard this word before, doesn't understand what it means to be non-binary, like what are those like basic kind of public education things that you've seen work in the past in terms of like messaging or framing around this that we can all kind of take with us and use in our communities that might resonate with people around like why this is, trans people have been around forever. It's just, we're only just now talking about it. I can understand that there's a real dissonance there. So it's like, how do you address that kind of piece of the puzzle?
Yeah. Sorry, my voice cracked. I think it's really important to have those conversations and really bring them down to the basics. There's a lot of presenters out there, a lot of the community that really find ways to talk about the basics and bring that education. And there's also some really great online and organizational information. So like the Trevor Project, GLAD, HRC, like Human Rights Campaign, and so many more. I could probably spend an entire hour listing off places that have really great community resources or really great education resources. And a lot of it does come down to the lack of education. Like you said, trans people have been around for a very long time. So it's not new. It's not a fad. It's just, like you said, we are just starting to talk about it. It's just starting to become a conversation that has becoming a larger conversation. And so we have folks coming in with really no education because it was never brought to them. It was never taught. It's never been presented. And so I think really the best things we can do is continue to just even put that basic information out there and encourage like more educational talks out there. A lot of times in formats like this, it's really great to come together with other people who may be wanting to learn the same and even having conversations together so that we can continue to process and learn education so that we can carry it out with us. So I really think that there's a benefit in making resources for knowledge as well, like just easily accessible everywhere. And as well as having a place for folks in the community to also have those opinions out, because that's the best way to learn. And so you can really answer any of these questions. I'm not going to just, I promise, go 1, 2, 3, 4 to answer them. We've got about 5 more minutes. So really just, it's an open platform for us to have discussion or really just share any takeaways or ways you think that the discussion can continue after leaving here today. I'm going to take the, oh, there we go. I was like, I'm going to take the lack of as like we're good, but I see one now.
Am I on? Did that work?
Yep, I can hear you.
Holy moly. Okay, there we go. So my question, and I came in a little later than I was anticipating, so I apologize for that. However, if you answered this, I apologize, but I am trying to raise 2 children in such a way that, and this is personal and also professional, in such a way that they are allies and that they are a safe space as well. And having those conversations with a 7 and a 9-year-old can be problematic sometimes. So I am trying to get y'all's opinion on how best to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't say too much about that, but I think that it's hard to have those discussions too when we think about development of those ages too. But also learning a way to present it as an age appropriate thing. There's some really great resources out there of like age appropriate books, age appropriate like content out there to kind of help guide in those conversations, because you're right, this is a lot to digest. It's a lot to take in as an adult as well as then adolescents. But how do we really break it down to younger children, because they're developmentally have a different like perception of the world. And so really it's just, I think a great way is those resources. I am huge on resources. There's some really great, there's some really great books out there that really like bring it down to a concept that children that age can understand.
Excellent. And I don't know, just kind of FYI, I don't know if anybody else knows this, but have you all ever heard of Little People, Big World books? There's one on RuPaul now. So that was one of the resources that we've been using, and we're just kind of very open, and we don't necessarily hide anything. But like you said, kind of putting it down into what a 7 and a 9-year-old can understand. So I appreciate you talking to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just as it looks like we have somebody that also wants to talk.
Okay. Can you hear me yet? This my camera's on. Well, let's use my mic.
Yes, I can hear you now. There's like a lag.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering. So I have a 7 and a 9-year-old. I'm a foster parent. I also have a 12, 15, 16, and 2 19-year-olds. And my 15 and 16-year-olds both currently identify as trans. And so it definitely has sparked a lot of conversations. And so my 9-year-old recently had said, that they do identify as a gender different than the one that they were born with. And I do think it's helpful to have those conversations about because I remember at 12 starting to identify as cis, or, like recognizing that I was cisgender. I didn't have the words at that time, but knowing that being female felt right, even if I didn't want to shave my armpits, even if I didn't want to do the social constructs of it, but it still was something that felt right. And so then it's been interesting watching my 9-year-old process it and then do it within a school context and within the context of family. But just having those conversations about what does it feel like in your body, whenever you think about being a mom, or if you think about being a dad, or if you think about ways of being. And I've struggled because I was raised where like girls can do anything and boys can do anything. And so part of me wants to be like, well, you can be female and still do anything, but it is a different conversation that we are having these days. And I'm supportive of my kids. And that's why I've gotten kids from other less supportive areas who are like 2 and 3 hours away from where they're from to get placed with me so they can be in a supportive home, but still just figuring out how to have those conversations. And it is difficult, and balancing other mental health issues that, a lot of my kiddos have going on, and ways to feel supportive and to have conversations, and for there not to be a right or a wrong way. But I had also posted in the chat, there was the FedEx delivery person had tattoos all over her body, and I had noticed that I thought she was trans. And so I was asking about the tattoos, and she was like, yeah, it opens up conversations because these are all animals in nature that are gender diverse. That, you know, like we're turtles or frogs where their gender can change based on temperatures and based on the needs of the society. So I was really impressed, you know, that she was willing in our not completely rural, but, you know, I live in the Midwest. It's not the most affirming place, you know, that she was willing to put herself out there through these tattoos and through starting those conversations. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation, but there's ways to do it, even with the 7 and the 9-year-olds, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone said that's an awesome tattoo idea, and I definitely agree. That
It was very cool.
Awesome. Well, I think we are at time. I can't see the clock, but I'm going to assume. Yes. And there is, like Suki just put in the chat, that there is a second from the bottom icon to complete that a survey. And it looks like you'll get some points.
Yes, yes. Remember, we are doing gamification on the platform today and tomorrow, and so there are potential prizes. And the more surveys you complete, the more opportunities you have to win things. And also, that is how you can collect your CEUs if that's something that you're doing. So it's the icon that has the little check marks. If you can see that, it's the second one from the bottom on the vertical menu. And thank you so much, Skylar, for your wisdom and experience that you shared with us today. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us. This has been a wonderful session. I have learned a lot, and look forward to continuing to connect with you all on the platform for the rest of today and tomorrow. And so you've got a short break now, so you can hop into some of the other pieces and parts, or just take a stretch break and then join us back in the live main session for our afternoon keynote.
Thank you so much for coming.